Good evening and welcome to Tracking the Tropics, your weekly in-depth look at the tropics and how it will impact you. I'm CBS 17 Chief Meteorologist Wes Hohenstein here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Welcome to week 2 of the Atlantic hurricane season. Here's what we have coming up on episode 2 of Tracking the Tropics.
I'm Fox 16 Chief Meteorologist Jeff Baskin, and coming up tonight on Tracking the Tropics, we're taking a deep dive into what the cone of uncertainty means and what it doesn't mean, the importance of looking at the cone, and why you don't want to focus too much on that forecast track that sometimes you see right down the middle. We'll be talking a lot more about that coming up tonight on Tracking the Tropics.
Hi, I'm Chief Meteorologist Jesse Gunkel from Baton Rouge. Tropical storm Cristobal brushed against us over the weekend. I'm going to show you the local impacts.
All right, we'll get to that in a second, but 9 days into the 2020 hurricane season already, we have seen 3 named storms. The most recent, Tropical Storm Cristobal. It's now a depression or an area of low pressure over the Midwest, believe it or not. Here's the historic track after it made landfall in South Louisiana on Sunday. Then it weakened, obviously, but it did not stop raining. Lots of rain across the Gulf Coast, even the Midwest. And tonight, how strange does this sound? A leftover tropical storm, a current tropical depression over parts of Iowa and Illinois, on its way to parts of Wisconsin. So even the northern Midwest will be talking about the hurricane season and the tropics impacting them. This was a tropical storm, so it wasn't a major impact, but that does not mean there were no impacts. Cristobal dumped incredible amounts of rain over the Gulf Coast after making landfall on Sunday. And although technically no longer a tropical system being tracked by the National Hurricane Center, it's still going to bring 2 to 4 inches of rain, maybe as high as 6 inches in parts of the Midwest. Cristobal, storm name number 3 of the season. It's already been a busy season. Of course, we started before June 1st with Arthur and Bertha. There's Cristobal. Dolly, Edouard, Faye, and Gonzalo would be next up on the name list for the 2020 Atlantic hurricane season. But it's not just Cristobal that's causing the attention of the National Hurricane Center. As we open things up and look at the larger Atlantic from the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean, and the entire Atlantic basin, the National Hurricane Center is actually keeping an eye on this little swirl of clouds way out in the open waters of the Atlantic. I mean, this is east of Bermuda, which is right here. There's the east coast of the United States. This has a 10% chance of developing over the next 2 to 5 days. It's moving into a part of the world where the water's too cool to sustain anything, let alone form. I mean, it would have a tough time forming in July and August, let alone June, when the water's too cool. So while technically there is something the Hurricane Center is keeping an eye on, the odds of anything happening with this are very, very low. So we kind of reset, again, a week and a half into the new hurricane season. And as we look at the graph of hurricane activity throughout the year, we all know that it peaks as we get into August and September. This graph shows hurricane activity throughout the years. And hurricanes and tropical storms are represented in red and just hurricanes in yellow. But you can see there's an obvious peak that happens the second week of September. So right now we are here at the very beginning of the season, and I always like to compare this side of the graph with the right side. So where we are now, the activity we get in early June is very, very low in the whole grand scheme of things over the years. But it's very similar to the other side when we're talking about the second or third week of November. So the activity we typically see this time of year is equal to the activity we usually see in November. Just to give you an idea of where we are and where we're going. Again, things really ramp up as we head into the beginning part of August. So where do storms typically form this time of year? For June, we have to look the Gulf of Mexico, the Western Caribbean, and right off the East Coast near the Bahamas. This map does a great job of showing where tropical systems have formed in history. We go all the way back to 1851. This is from Colorado State, and it takes us all the way up to last year. So everywhere you see a dot is where a tropical system formed in the month of June. And where are they all forming? Western Caribbean, the Gulf of Mexico, and just off the East Coast. It's very hard to get anything to form out in the open waters of the Atlantic. So for the next 3 weeks during the month of June, this is the area that we will keep a closer eye on. This is the area where it's most likely to see tropical formation. That map from Colorado State, well, Colorado State came out with their updated hurricane forecast in the last few days. I know Colorado, you don't think of hurricanes generally, but Colorado State and the meteorologists there are some of the best in the world at forecasting hurricanes. They've been doing it for decades. Their original forecast back in April called for a busy season of 16 named storms, 8 hurricanes, 4 major hurricanes. That's above the averages of 12, 6, and 3, so 16, 8, and 4. Well, the most recent forecast they issued just a couple of days ago includes the first 3 named storms of this season, and they've upped their numbers. 19 named storms is now their forecast, 9 of those becoming hurricanes and holding at 4 major hurricanes. So an active season is trending toward being even more active, according to the meteorologist at Colorado State. So today is a pretty important day in hurricane history. This is the day that Hurricane Alma hit the coast of Florida back in 1966. This is a satellite shot of June 7th, 1966, 2 days before this storm hit the coast of Florida. And it's an important storm. I know it's a horrible satellite shot, but this is 1966. It's an important storm because this is the earliest hurricane, earliest in the calendar year, that a hurricane has ever hit the continental United States. And that happened back in 1966 on this day, June 9th. So here was the track of Hurricane Alma. Again, the earliest U.S. hurricane landfall when you consider our records that go all the way back to 1851. It formed in Central America, moved into the Western Caribbean. Remember, one of the spots we just talked about where it intensified to a Category 2, came over the west side of Cuba, brushed the Florida Keys, brought 10 inches of rain to Miami, brought 70 to 90 mile-per-hour winds to the Tampa Bay area before moving inland. And then look at that right turn it took, moving off the coast of South Carolina and parts of North Carolina, and then turning a little more north before getting in some cooler waters and weakening. So there you have it. On this day, back in 1966, Hurricane Alma made landfall on the coast of Florida, the earliest hurricane to ever make landfall in the continental United States. Now, Cristobal was not a hurricane, but it did cause some problems. And for that, we bring in our first guest from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, NBC 33 Chief Meteorologist Jesse Gunkel. Jesse in South Louisiana just finished up with Tropical Storm Cristobal. So let's check in with him to see how the past few days have been.
Hey Wes, well thanks for having me on. Obviously we got brushed by Cristobal as it made its way through our viewing area over the weekend and finally lifted out of here in the early morning hours of Monday. A lot of people here were saying it was a bust, the forecast, but not so fast. In fact, actually it was right on the mark for a lot of locations. It verified obviously our forecast, and if you look at some of these rain estimates when we were originally showing model runs that even started out, I would say 3 to 4 days prior, we were talking in the southern Gulf as the system was developing, coming across the Straits of Mexico and then moving into the Bay of Campeche after it kind of sat on the Yucatan Peninsula for a few days. It finally moved across those open waters. It started to strengthen a little bit by the time we got into the weekend, so late Saturday, moving into early Sunday before making landfall roughly around 5 o'clock on Sunday evening. Again, that was the main time frame, but for most of the impacts, obviously, it sat well east of our viewing area. You can see the difference here. This was a very atypical system. It's not what you're used to seeing. It was asymmetric, meaning all the thunderstorm activity sat on the eastern side of the system, and eventually it started to wrap around on the northern side, but the western side had a lot of dry air getting infused into the system, and it was relatively dry. You can see the difference here. The center of Cristobal came right between Baton Rouge and Hammond, and you can see where some of those outer rain bands eventually came back in. But here's the story. Notice where all of those thunderstorms, the heavy rainfall, the largest storm surge, all of that sat along the northern Gulf Coast from areas such as Bay St. Louis all the way to Gulfport, Biloxi, Ocean Springs, Pascagoula, and even into Mobile Bay. But here's why I'm saying it verified, because when we were originally talking 3 to 4 days out, estimates were putting it at about maybe 10 inches of rain in some locations. Well, that did verify out there. As you see here, we had a band here, and even in our viewing area, a pocket of 6 to 8 inches of rainfall. That same band moved in just north of the area, and as you can see here, anywhere from about 4 to 6 inches of rainfall. Most areas kind of fell in that 2 to 4 inch range. Everything west of the Mississippi River, that's where it quickly dropped off. Luckily, we didn't have to worry about too much in the way of tornadoes, and obviously it was a little bit drier further, but it really didn't dry up for us until we got to early on Monday, and that's when those last remaining bands finally moved out of here as that system started to pick up a little bit of forward speed and then move up through the Mississippi River Valley. Now it's actually an issue for the state of Wisconsin, which is also making this a very peculiar system out there. So take a look at the potential impacts out there. When we were doing the forecast days ahead, we said 2 to 4. That's what we had in the capital area out there. Locally, 6 to 8, and that's exactly what happened in those main feeder bands. So you can see what happens. Deep tropical moisture in place, and it can cause a lot of rain in a short amount of time. We're talking anywhere from 1 inch to 2 inches per hour, and we did see that in some locations. Now, some of our lakes, again, they did swell a little bit. We had a coastal flood advisory that actually expired early this morning, so it took a few days just because we had a southerly wind, and that stuck around for multiple days. I also want to point out again, we did have some gusts, mainly in the 25 to 35, but we did have a couple higher gusts out there. Most of those stronger winds sat around New Orleans and towards the west. So again, really this for us was a wake-up call, kind of getting people ready for this upcoming season, and hopefully, I know the forecast is calling for an active one, but let's just hope none of those storms head here again.
All right, Jesse, good stuff. Stay safe down there in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. That is NBC 33 Chief Meteorologist Jesse Gunkel. All right, throughout the year, you see us talk about the hurricane forecast cone a lot. But just how does the National Hurricane Center come up with that cone? Well, Jeff Baskin from KLRT in Little Rock, Arkansas joins us now to answer that. But Jeff, you also had Cristobal come right over Little Rock. How are things with you guys?
We did get a lot of rain associated with it. The center actually went pretty much right over Arkansas, came through Louisiana, very close to New Orleans with some storm surge and some very heavy rain, coastal flooding, especially on the eastern side of that circulation. And when I was in New Orleans, we really had to watch for even weaker tropical systems, especially when they came inland just to the west, because that could still produce a significant storm surge and coastal flooding. Well, the center came up through Louisiana and into Arkansas. That happened yesterday morning and moved right through central Arkansas, almost right over Little Rock, and then through northern Arkansas, although as the center moved over, really there wasn't a whole lot left with the system. Just a little bit of light rain, not a whole lot of wind near the center either. Now, as we take a look at rainfall totals, we did have a good soaking rainfall, widespread 2 to 3 inches of rain, locally up to 4 inches. Now, this was spread over many hours, so we did not have any widespread flooding associated with this. And the good thing about Cristobal is that it was moving relatively quickly. It didn't stall, it didn't do any loops, so that's why we didn't see any excessive rainfall totals. We've had tropical systems that have done that in the past. We have to watch out for the remnants of these systems sometimes in Arkansas, but fortunately we avoided that. As far as winds, we didn't see anything too significant. Generally some wind gusts about 30, 35 miles per hour. There were some stronger wind gusts well removed from the center, especially across parts of northeast Arkansas, where we did have some wind gusts about 40 to 45 miles per hour. And even though the winds weren't really all that strong in central Arkansas, there were a couple of trees that came down because the soil very, very saturated. It didn't take much to get a couple of trees to become uprooted. Now, coming up here in just a minute, we're going to talk about the forecast cone, which is one of the most common products that you see when we're talking about tropical forecasts. Wes?
Jeff, as you said, I mean, one time you guys were directly in the forecast cone for Cristobal, and that cone is such an important tool during the hurricane season, but there's a lot that goes into producing it at the National Hurricane Center. So can you kind of take us through what that is and what it isn't?
Well, that's right, Wes. You're used to seeing the forecast cone. This is one of the most common products that comes out from the National Hurricane Center, but you may not know exactly what that represents. It's not actually as obvious as it seems. Now, the cone represents where the storm is going to wind up 2/3 of the time. And the cone is made up of what we call probability circles of where the storm is likely to be within a 2/3 chance for each of those forecast points. You add up all the forecast points, and that's how you get your cone. We'll talk about these probability circles a little more coming up in just a second here. Now, the cone area is for the center of the storm. So when we say 2/3 probability of it moving within the cone, that means the center. And of course, you can get significant impacts from the storm well away from the center. So the cone size is based on the average forecast air from the previous years. So that's how you get your width for each point. So every storm is going to have the same cone for a given year. Now, over the years, the cone size is changing because the cone size gets smaller as the average air decreases. So now we'll take a look at some of the misconceptions that we have about the cone. The cone does not represent the size or forecast size of the storm. Sometimes I'll listen to people go, oh, wow, look how big that storm is going to be 5 days from now. No, that's not what that means. That just means the increasing air as you go out in time. The cone does not show area of impact. Not every place within the cone is necessarily going to see significant impacts from the storm, and it is quite possible that significant impacts can occur well outside the cone, especially in the case of a large system or if there is more air with that system. So cone size does not represent the confidence of an individual forecast. So the cone size is always going to be the same, regardless of the confidence of that individual forecast. Not all forecasts are necessarily high confidence. Sometimes you may have a scenario in which the computer models may be showing all sorts of different solutions. One group of models might be showing a turn west into the Gulf. Another group of models may be showing a turn north into the Atlantic. In other cases, you might have a very good agreement among all the computer models and a very well-defined steering currents and a very high confidence forecast. But that cone is going to be the same size. So the cone size is going to be the same for all storms in the same year for those forecast points. So let's take a look at what those probability circles really mean and what those errors are at different points in the forecast. So the probability of it moving within the cone is 2/3 chance based on the probability circle. So here's that probability circle for 12 hours, which means that there is a 2/3 chance that the storm center will wind up within 26 miles of that point. That is at 12 hours. And you might think, well, that doesn't sound like very much, but actually it can mean the difference between a significant impact for a certain location or not a significant impact, especially if we're talking about a stronger storm with a well-defined eye, because you get outside that eye and impacts are usually quite a bit less. Now, as we go out to 24 hours, the error goes to 41 miles. So that 2/3 chance is going to wind up within 41 miles. It goes to 69 miles as we get to 48 hours. And as we go through time, that probability circle keeps on getting bigger, 103 miles at 72 hours. You can see that would encompass a fairly large area at that time. So the confidence really starts to decrease, especially as you start to get days 4 and 5, 151 miles at 96 hours. And here's the probability circle at 5 days. It really becomes big, 196 miles and a 2/3 chance that the center will pass within this circle at the 5-day point. But notice how big that area is. That's an area from nearly Cuba encompassing the entire Bahamas. So you really got to pay close attention to not just the center forecast, but the forecast cone. Wes?
Yeah, a bunch of circles making a cone. I don't think a lot of people realize that. You know, Jeff, when we do our daily high temperature forecast, people like us to do an exact number. They don't like a range. You know, they want to know if it's going to be 83 or 89. They don't want to know it's going to be in the 80s. But having a range for the forecast cone and not an exact line, not an exact number, is very important. And we've had some examples of that in history, and you've got one of them.
Well, yes, this is one of the forecasts. We go back in time here. Actually, I forgot to show this. This is the actual addition of all these probability circles that make up that cone. So you add up the probability circles, and that is how the National Hurricane Center draws that cone. Now, here's a real-life example of this. I'm going to take you back to 2008. This was Hurricane Ike. At one point, fairly powerful hurricane way out in the Atlantic Ocean. And here was the forecast line at that time, taking it through the Bahamas and then aiming it right towards South Florida, and the forecast intensity, a Category 3 hurricane. So there was, I remember I was in South Florida at that time, and people started talking about it. Oh, Ike is heading right towards us. Well, that wasn't actually the forecast, because this was the cone at the time. And you might be thinking, that cone looks a little bit bigger than the one that you just showed a couple of minutes ago. And that's because, well, in 2008, the forecast air was greater, so the cone was bigger. So we've gotten better in terms of the forecast air over the years. So at 5 days, the 120-hour forecast had a Category 3 hurricane moving right into South Florida for the center line track. But when you looked at the entire cone, it actually showed the hurricane could wind up anywhere between the Northern Caribbean and the Bahamas at 5 days. So when you look at the actual forecast track from Ike, it actually stayed within the cone during that entire 5-day period. So you can see this is the blue line indicating the actual track moving into Cuba and actually out into the Northern Caribbean before coming back into the Gulf of Mexico. So the actual position at 5 days compared to this forecast was within the cone, but quite a ways from the center. So the actual position at 5 days showed the storm moving across Cuba and into the Gulf of Mexico. And because it moved across land, that made a big difference in the intensity. So at that point, it was a Category 1 hurricane. Also something to note, Ike was a rather large circulation, so the center was within the cone, but you had tropical storm force conditions that were well outside the cone at 5 days. So really a very important thing to realize when you look at the cone. You can't focus on that center line. You need to look at the entire cone and also realize that it's not necessarily going to stay in the cone every time. It means that there's a 2/3 chance that the storm is going to stay within that cone. So when you see those hurricane forecasts this season, when you see that cone, you know exactly what it means.
Yeah, good reminder, Jeff, especially since, as you said, some storms are 500-600 miles wide, and, it's not just where that center is, it's where the whole circulation is going to be. Good stuff, Jeff. Jeff is down in Little Rock, Arkansas. Check him out next time you are down there. Jeff, thanks for being with us tonight. Before we say goodnight, it's not all about the Atlantic side. The Pacific side is also in the beginning part of their hurricane season. Their season starts a few weeks before the Atlantic side, and right now there's still not a whole lot going on. The intertropical convergence zone, kind of closer to the equator, down farther south, typically has a lot of activity, but nothing that's showing any signs of becoming a named tropical system. But remember, Tropical Storm Cristobal actually started off as a Pacific storm, Tropical Storm Amanda. They have a completely different list than the Atlantic side on the Pacific side. Amanda started off in the Pacific, crossed over Central America into the Gulf of Mexico, where it became Tropical Storm Cristobal. So, we don't often pay as much attention to the Pacific side because most of us live on the side that's going to be impacted by the Atlantic, but every once in a while we do need to pay close attention to that. So we'll keep an eye on both the Pacific and the Atlantic side throughout the rest of this hurricane season. There's a long way to go, and we're glad you're here with us. Thank you so much for joining us for tonight's Tracking the Tropics. Don't forget, we'll be here every Tuesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern throughout the Atlantic hurricane season. And thank you for spending part of your night with us live in Raleigh, North Carolina. I'm Wes Hohenstein.